Hi, I'm John Lee, Professor of Social Studies Education at North Carolina State University. Welcome to Module 1 of our Disciplinary Literacy in Social Studies series, which is focused on the question, what are disciplinary literacies? This is the first in a series of 5 modules focused on disciplinary literacies in social studies. Each module contains related background material, videos, assessment, and a pause, reflect, and apply activity, all designed to support social studies teachers in Hawaii as you use disciplinary literacy strategies in your classrooms. The content in this series is organized around the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 framework for state standards in social studies, specifically Dimension 2. And this series also supports inquiry-based teaching and learning as envisioned in the C3 framework. The core disciplines in social studies of civics, economics, geography, and history provide the overall structure for this webinar series. The 5 videos in this series include this first video, which highlights background material and information on disciplinary literacies, and offers activities for enhancing the teaching of disciplinary literacies. The other 4 videos and modules focus on disciplinary literacies in each of the core content areas of civics, economics, geography, and history. So, let's get started. In our Introduction to Disciplinary Literacies, we've structured this video around 4 topics. First is our question, what are disciplinary literacies? We'll examine that question and try to come to some clarity about what we mean when we say disciplinary literacies. We'll look at the C3 framework and explain how it connects to disciplinary literacies. We'll also focus on Dimension 2 of the C3. That's where you find the content areas that are used to frame this series. And we'll look at something called the disciplinary matrix, which offers an example of how disciplinary literacies work in the core content areas. Disciplinary literacies is an advanced form of literacy that builds upon what Shanahan and Shanahan call basic and intermediate literacies. We'll talk more about those in just a minute, but let me note now that disciplinary literacies are different than content area literacies, or content area reading, where reading teachers use sources from the disciplines to reinforce more general literacy skills. As we'll see, disciplinary literacies are unique to the content or disciplinary areas and thus require different strategies when being introduced and used in the classroom. So let's look at Shanahan and Shanahan's thinking about literacies and the image on this slide, which is a hierarchy of literacies. As you can see on this slide, the figure illustrates the relationship among the different levels of literacy in school. Basic literacies include those general skills that children need to read, including the ability to decode and knowledge of high-frequency words. These skills are needed for virtually all reading tasks. Intermediate literacies are those common skills that students use to make meaning while they read. These intermediate skills include generic comprehension, understanding common word meanings, and basic fluency. Shanahan and Shanahan describe disciplinary literacies as an approach that, quote, emphasizes the specialized knowledge and abilities possessed by those who create, communicate, and use knowledge within each of the disciplines. We'll come back to that definition as we go through this series, emphasizing the uniqueness of disciplinary literacies given the ways of thinking within the disciplines. Our focus in this webinar series are these disciplinary literacies, and specifically the disciplinary literacies that are brought forward in the C3 framework. With the publication of the C3 framework, disciplinary literacies are increasingly important. The C3 describes disciplinary literacies as the concepts and tools that are unique in the 4 disciplines of social studies. Again, those are civics, economics, geography, and history. And I'll repeat, It's the concepts and tools that the C3 framework addresses with regard to disciplinary literacies, and we're going to find that information in Dimension 2 of the C3. So this is Dimension 2 of the C3 framework, or at least the cover page. The concepts and tools described in Dimension 2 of the C3 framework are articulated in 58 indicator pathways. These are articulated at 4 grade bands, and they describe the things that students should know and be able to do at the end of 4 grade bands. Those are K2, 3-5, 6-8, and 9-12. For each of the 58 indicator pathways, there are 4 grade band statements about relevant concepts and tools. All told, there are 217 statements. Now, if you're doing your math, 58 times 4 does not equal 217, but you'll find as you go through the Dimension 2 of the C3 framework that several of the indicator pathways do not start until the later grades, 3, 5, 6, 8, and even one that begins only exist at grades 9, 12. We'll take a look at some of these indicator pathways later in the articulations of the indicator at different grade bands. For now, let's continue to focus on general sense on the disciplines within the field. The 58 indicator pathways in Dimension 2 are distributed evenly across the 4 core disciplines of social studies. Civics has 14 indicators, economics has 15 indicators, geography has 12, and history has 17. There's a lot going on in Dimension 2, but what we're going to do is to focus on the big categories that are revealed in these indicators. And those categories are the concepts and the tools that are unique within the disciplines. In order to do this, we've classified each of these 58 indicator pathways as being primarily focused on either concepts or tools. So as you can see here, civics, economics, and geography are primarily conceptual in their focus. So in civics, 11 of the 14 indicators focus on concepts. In economics, it's 12 of the 15, and in geography, it's 9 of the 12 indicators that focus on concepts. The opposite is true of history. History is more tool-based. So of the 17 indicators, 12 are focused on tools and just 5 on concepts. This may come as a surprise to some. There are, of course, stereotypes of these disciplines, and we oftentimes think about civics as politics, economics as statistics, and maybe geography as mapping. Then we think about history as just stories that are being told or read about. But as you'll see, the disciplinary experts see this differently. They see civics, economics, and geography as highly conceptual, and history as highly tools-focused. So we'll see an example here. This is the first indicator in the civics strand of Dimension 2, and it describes what students should understand about the roles, responsibilities, and powers of people in authority and institutions in government. This indicator pathway has 4 specific indicators at each of the 4 grade bands. It's highly conceptual in that it focuses on these concepts of roles and responsibilities, as well as powers of people in authority and institutions in government. So, as you'll see, not all 58 indicators focus on tools. Most of them, in fact, are concept-based. And these concept-based indicators help us understand what students need to know in order to make meaning out of content within the field. Disciplinary literacies are about more than just reading and writing. Disciplinary literacies include all the skills that are needed to understand, create, and communicate academic knowledge. It's within the regular ways of doing business within the disciplines that we find disciplinary literacies. We can go back to Shanahan's quote about how it's the unique practices and ways of thinking in the disciplines that make disciplinary literacies what they are. Experts from the disciplines actually wrote the indicators in Dimension 2, and in their work we have examples of an insight about regular practices and ways of thinking in those disciplines. We'll examine those ideas as they're represented in Dimension 2 of the C3 framework, focusing on each of the 4 content areas or disciplines separately. And we'll think about how we can support students who are mostly novice at these skills or using these tools and these ways of thinking or conceptual ideas as students become more expert in those practices. It is the distinction within the disciplines that make disciplinary literacies unique. And it's what differentiates literacy in one area from literacy in another area. In fact, sometimes we talk about this as disciplinary literacies as thinking like an economist, or thinking like a geographer, or thinking like a historian. The C3 framework emphasizes this as well. And here's a quote that powerfully recognizes that. So I'll read this quote. The C3 framework emphasizes the disciplinary concepts and practices that support students as they develop the capacity to know, analyze, explain, and argue about the interdisciplinary challenges in our social world. So these concepts and tools, these practices, as we sometimes call them in the C3 framework, provide teachers with important information about the literacy students ought to practice on a regular basis in the social studies classroom. So we're going to take a look now at what we call the disciplinary matrix. And this is an example of disciplinary thinking in the disciplines from the C3 framework. This example is an appendix to the C3 framework. And again, it's what we call the disciplinary inquiry matrix. It describes how experts in the disciplines think about each of the 4 dimensions in the inquiry arc. So the full matrix addresses all 4 dimensions in the C3 inquiry arc. The first dimension on questions, the second dimension on content areas, the third dimension on using sources and evidence, and the fourth dimension on communicating conclusions and taking informed action. Here, we'll focus specifically on the second dimension, and that is where we find these concepts and tools that are unique within the discipline that are ultimately representative of the disciplinary literacies that we want to emphasize in social studies. In our disciplinary matrix, we use the example of the Great Recession. And using this example, we asked experts within the disciplines to tell us some ways that they think about questions, and then to tell us how they use content in their field to address those questions. So on this slide, you'll see some of the questions that experts in the disciplines pose. So an expert in civics might ask, what have major political parties proposed to respond to the Great Recession? An expert in history, if you look over in the far right column, might ask something like, what precedents in the past help us understand the Great Recession? Then if you look at the bottom row, the key strategies and skills needed to address these questions, here you'll find examples of conceptual knowledge and tools within the discipline, or the disciplinary literacies, that experts in the field might use to make sense out of those questions. So someone in civics might need to read statistics from polls. In geography, they might need to understand map symbols and do critical reading and thinking of maps. So this slide gives us an example of disciplinary literacies. And as we move into the content areas, we'll explore more examples and specifically look at the indicators from each of the content areas in the disciplines to understand more about disciplinary literacies. In summary, disciplinary literacies are the unique ways of thinking and doing within the disciplines. Our job as teachers is to support students as they develop skills and use these tools when thinking about disciplinary sources. We also have to support students as they build up the conceptual knowledge from the field that will enable them to think more deeply and solve problems, answer compelling questions that emerge from those fields. Now that you've watched this video, please complete the assessment accompanying this video and make sure you check out the background readings. The background readings will help fill in some of the gaps and expand on some of the ideas that I've explained in this video. I've also included a pause, reflect, and apply activity where you can think about some of the things you're already doing with disciplinary literacies in your teaching and connect it to what you're learning about in this webinar series. Next up, we'll examine the discipline of civics, and we'll look at the unique strategies and skills that are used in this field and how we might support students to use these skills and strategies to understand the concepts and apply the tools within the field to solve problems and respond to compelling questions. Thank you.